Welcome to E Squared Emporium for all things AP Psychology. Today we're going to talk about attachment. So Mary Ainsworth came up with the attachment styles that we're going to be discussing. She came up with an experiment, really an observation called the Strange Situation in 1970. So this measures how a child explores their environment. So first in the presence of the caregiver, usually the mother in these experiments in the 1970s, and then in the absence of their caregiver, what happens when the mother leaves the room, and then in the presence of a stranger, someone that the infant doesn't know. This is the way that she tested child's separation anxiety and stranger anxiety, but it also helped to determine if the child has a secure or an insecure attachment style, and this is still used today. So parents will leave the room while the child is playing, and we're looking for a few things. Does the child cry when the parent leaves? Is the child happy when the parent returns? Does the parent returning comfort the child? Or is the child not at all comforted by the fact that the parent just returned? So this leads to 4 attachment styles or strategies which are survival for the child. So Mary Ainsworth studied these interactions between caregivers and their children. How emotionally available were the parents? And this influenced the type of attachment that children form. So the way that infants get their needs met by their parents significantly contributes to this attachment style or strategy. And so in longitudinal studies, they were able to see that these attachment styles were still reflected later in adult relationships. So the first one is secure attachment. So people here are very comfortable discussing their feelings, very comfortable showing affection. They have high levels of confidence. They are capable of accepting rejection and moving on from the word no. They tend to be very loyal, very trustworthy, and very capable of trusting others. They're very comfortable being themselves. They will talk about what's upsetting them. They're not really worried about their partner or boyfriend, girlfriends leaving them. They offer support, and they tend to be more satisfied as adults in their later relationships. So if you see yourself pretty clearly, if you feel like you can stay grounded, if you're able to talk through difficult subjects, if you're able to stay open, you don't feel like you're shutting down or what we call getting emotionally flooded, then you probably have a secure attachment style. So secure attachment for children. They will express distress when the caregiver leaves, but they quickly calm down when mom or dad return. They feel very protected by their caregiver. They trust that their caregiver will return for them, and they wait without becoming anxious or upset. They respond well to discipline, and so they have what we call resilience. They can deal with hearing no and having problems, and they have great flexibility. Signs that we're secure as adults. You have a positive view of yourself and others. You have a healthy sense of self-esteem. You're okay with intimacy. You feel comfortable with that, but you have boundaries. No one's going to step over your boundaries. You are self-sufficient, but you can ask for support when you need it. You're capable of trusting others at your job and friends. You're very comfortable being vulnerable. And you know that you can rely on the people around you for support and understanding. So people with secure attachments have healthier relationships as adults. Let's go over insecure attachments. Now we're going to go over several different types, but just as an overall description, insecure attachment styles, they're very sensitive to attachment issues in the relationship, not good at all at expressing feelings and communicating. Typically, it was inconsistent parenting that led to this. Not being able to trust the parent's behavior leads to an insecure attachment style. The child doesn't understand why the parent is behaving in a certain manner. If the child lacks stability and can't predict the future, then the child can't feel secure. So people who grew up in a chaotic environment tend to struggle with attachment. So people who grew up with a parent who has a mental illness, a parent who had schizophrenia or borderline personality disorder are just 2 examples. A parent who was abusive, any type of abuse, a parent who was an alcoholic or had an addiction issue. This can lead to insecure attachment. So the children are constantly scanning the environment looking for threats, and often triggered. And as adults, we're often triggered by someone who reminds you of that situation in childhood where you felt trapped or helpless or scared. Now we're going to break them down. So the avoidant insecure attachment style. Now, these are people who avoid intimacy. They're very independent, but they really don't want you to get too close. They fear people trying to control them or trap them, so they'll distance themselves from friends and partners. So they design their life to avoid too much intimate contact or too much commitment. They prefer to maybe work by themselves, to keep by themselves. They do not want to talk about their feelings. They do not want to open up and share too much. They don't want to give anybody the chance to let them down. So they often will respond when somebody gets too close. They feel anxious, helpless, or distrustful. So the anxious insecure attachment style have trouble trusting people. They need constant reassurance. They may have trouble being alone. They may be jealous. They may be scared, paranoid that you're leaving. They may fall into unhealthy or very abusive relationships. They want a partner to complete them or to rescue them. They may have difficulty forgiving others, trusting others, and maintaining relationships. They may become overly emotional, often erratic or irrational to the people around them. It makes sense to them, but not to everybody else. They may complain about their partner, but also burst into tears at the same time and be terrified of losing their partner all at the same time. Disorganized is what we call fearful insecure attachment, and it's kind of a combination of all of that. It is a fear of rejection or abandonment, inconsistent behaviors, very difficult to maintain relationships. It is the most extreme and the least common type of attachment. So, inconsistent behaviors means push me, pull me. I want to be close. I'm going to push you away when I feel too close. But I want to be close, but I'm going to push you away when I feel too close. Anxiety. You're getting too close. I feel really anxious, but I also feel really anxious when you're too far away. Difficulty being vulnerable with others, low self esteem, fear of abandonment, and depression all go along with this style. And again, this style may come from a very tumultuous or traumatic childhood, a lot of fear or abuse, but also an erratic or incoherent relationship with the primary caregiver. It could be a caregiver who left, who abandoned, who never kept their promises. So again, here's her attachment theory and all the different types. Let's go into some other attachment theories. So, separation anxiety is a generic term for how an infant or toddler feels when they are separated from their parent or their main caregiver. And it is normal for young children to have a period of time where they're anxious or distressed. The first day of kindergarten, you leave them at daycare, you've left them at grandma's house. They were just fine last week, but this week they're fussy and they're crying and they're scared. Maybe a baby gets fussy when you've passed them around to a new person. So, a fear of being separated from home or family. Often you can have nightmares. Kids can get stomach aches and headaches. Maybe they don't want to go to school or daycare for a few days. So, your temperament plays a lot into separation anxiety, and your attachment style, how secure you feel with your parents, your primary caregivers, can play a huge role. Now, this can go into separation anxiety disorder, which we'll talk about more in the disorders unit, but I'm just going to briefly mention it here. This is extreme worry, right? This is now as an adult, as a teenager or an adult. You're terrified of going to work or when somebody else leaves you to go to work. You might avoid getting a promotion at work. You might avoid any new activity as a teenager. You might refuse to spend any time alone. Maybe you still have to sleep in the same bedroom with a sister or a brother or a parent or something because you're too afraid of being alone. You might have constant nightmares, an excessive use of sick time as an adult, constantly calling in for sick time. So, from a biological point of view, we see that this could be inherited. We talked about epigenetics, so the tendency to be anxious, or it could be an imbalance of your neurotransmitters, your brain chemicals, norepinephrine and serotonin. Or it could be an environmental. It could be learning anxiety and fear from family members or even from friends. Let's go into another theory. Harry Harlow came up with contact theory in 1965. So this was a very classic study with primates. It has some ethical issues we will talk about. So researchers believed that babies became attached to their mothers because of food, only food. And Harlow argued that he didn't think it was about food, that there's an importance to being comforted, the companionship, the love, the warmth in promoting healthy development. So, of course, we couldn't do this with human babies. There were major ethical issues. He chose to do this with monkey babies, which still has ethical issues. But he wanted to show the impact of contact comfort on primate development. And his studies did change our understanding of the role of social relationships in early development and that it is not just about food. So here's what he did. He used infant monkeys and he took them away from their biological mothers. And they were raised in a laboratory with no contact at all with adult monkeys. Some he placed into social isolation. They were completely isolated for a very long period of time. These monkeys showed very disturbed behavior. They stared blankly at the wall. They circled their cages. They were self-mutilating, and that's part of the ethical issues. These isolated infants were then reintroduced back to the group of baby infant monkeys, and they did not know how to interact. They had no idea how to make friends or how to share or what to do. They were just absolutely terrified. Many of them stayed separate from the group the entire time, and some died after refusing to eat completely. So then he changed the experiment slightly and he brought in two surrogate mothers, like artificial mothers. One was a wire monkey mother and one was the soft cloth monkey mother. And he would practice putting the food on each mother. He could put a bottle with food on the soft mother or on the wire mother and to try to see how the babies responded. Every single time, the babies chose the soft cloth mother even if the food was on the other mother. The babies liked the contact, the warmth. You can see that they're hugging. They needed to be held. They needed that contact. And this is why we call it contact theory. So the infant monkeys all spent significantly more time with the terry cloth mother. And when only the wire mother had food, then the babies would come to the wire mother just to feed, but then immediately return and cling to the cloth surrogate. So they would also run to their soft cloth mothers for comfort when they had new and scary situations. He brought in toys that made noise, he brought in all kinds of scary stuff, and they would run to the soft mother. But the monkeys that didn't have a surrogate mother, they were paralyzed with fear and they huddled up in a ball. And this very clever monkey, this shows an example, they would hang on to the soft cloth mother, but reach over to get the food from the wire mother. So they got to be very, very clever about this. But again, these babies were deprived of comfort, and this shows what happens when you don't have the soft cloth mother. So monkeys who had complete deprivation, they often died. They just gave up and they went into this formation and they would not attach, or some of them became quite aggressive. They would fight and become quite aggressive. Some died of what they would say, they literally died of stress or fright. Some would not mate if they made it to adulthood, or if they did mate, they were very neglectful parents. They left their babies and were very neglectful. So definitely some consequences from deprivation of contact. There are many ethical issues to this. In fact, it's called the pit of despair. If you ever look this up in your studies, one of the most unethical studies, the pit of despair. So extreme stress and suffering inflicted on baby animals, severe isolation for extended periods of time. The monkey infants were intensely disturbed when they came out of isolation. They were deprived of mothers, taken from their mothers at birth. This was considered unnecessary and cruel. There was a lack of consideration for animal welfare. They prioritized the research goals over the animal suffering. These monkeys had long-lasting psychological trauma well into adulthood and, not mating, being terrible parents, all of that. It caused significant psychological distress and highly disturbed behavior, including self-mutilation. And many of the monkey babies just stopped eating and just withered away and died of starvation. A large, significant number of infant monkeys died during this study. They won't even publish how many monkey babies died from this study. But what do we learn from this? We see that humans, also deprived of comfort, have similar responses. If we look at orphanages, foster care situations, abusive homes, we see that children raised in those environments are also withdrawn, frightened. Some don't get speech, like we talked about Jeannie. They also become abusers when they get to be adults. They suffer nightmares, PTSD, depression. They also self-mutilate, drug and alcohol abuse, suicidal thoughts, teenage pregnancy, uh, gang-related violence, binge eating, severe aggression, and a link to criminal behavior. We have also in our later unit reactive attachment disorder known as RAD. This is a disorder where children fail to form attachments to their caregivers at that critical period. We've talked about critical periods. So between 6 months and 3 years, if you are in an abusive situation, a neglectful situation, separated from primary caregivers, foster homes, death of a parent, any of those situations, we already talked about orphanages, war, refugee camps, we see problematic behaviors. Children become obsessive, controlling, they can't attach, they have relationship issues, more risk taking, they can't tell right from wrong, they lack empathy, they don't have what we call the stranger danger response. We see this leads into criminal behavior, antisocial behavior, oppositional defiant behavior. So this leads us into what happens for children who are in abusive situations. So there is a definition of PTSD for children called childhood PTSD, sometimes written as CPTSD. So post-traumatic stress disorder in children. It can develop after exposure to trauma, to abuse, to neglect, or to a serious accident. A serious enough car accident can cause this. Going through the fires in LA, going through a hurricane, going through some incident that was very, very scary, just going through environmental disasters, going through an earthquake. Children experience emotional and physical distress, flashbacks, difficulty sleeping, insomnia. They're irritable, they're aggressive, they might be depressed and numb, they can't concentrate at school, they don't want to talk to their friends. So all kinds of different behaviors change. And again, the causes, any kind of abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, serious accidents, natural disasters. And this leads us to the ACEs, Aversive Childhood Experiences, ACEs. So what is this? Again, this is any traumatic experience. It could include physical, verbal, or sexual abuse. It can include physical or emotional neglect. It could be witnessing violence, losing a parent, living with somebody who abuses drugs or alcohol, or really any kind of obsessive behavior, any kind of addictive behavior. Witnessing a stressful or traumatic event, right? Being in a refugee camp, seeing a disaster, going through a war or death. And it could just be basic household dysfunction, divorce, yelling, shouting, domestic violence. There are sociocultural variations and things that it might depend on. We see socioeconomic status, money may have an impact on neglect, food insecurity, housing instability. You know, we have children, we have teenagers in the county who are sleeping in their cars at night and they are homeless and still trying to go to school the next day and having to figure out where to get their food and where to shower. So that happens in all over the United States. Exposure to violence due to increased stress related to poverty. So the more a child is raised in poverty, the more likely they are to be exposed to these ACEs. Race, ethnicity, and geographic location can play a part of it. We see communities that have been marginalized, groups of people that have been marginalized, are more likely to experience ACEs. Cultural norms, they can really influence. Sometimes in the culture, uh, it's normalized, harsh discipline of children or harsh discipline between husbands and wives. It is normalized. This is what the culture says is normal. And so it may not be reported. Child abuse may not be reported. Stressors like poverty and discrimination and negative peer selection. So the more a child is raised in these situations, the more likely they are to join gangs. Long-term outcomes. Well, we see chronic health conditions. If you experienced ACEs as a child, you are more likely to have cancer as an adult, asthma, diabetes, heart disease, and so forth. We know it changes your brain development. We know it changes how your body responds to stress, cortisol levels, coping capacities, stress reactivity. You are more likely to abuse substances or to have some sort of addictive behavior. You're more likely to smoke or vape. You're more likely to have mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and other psychiatric disorders. And you're probably less likely to get the help that you need. You're more likely to practice risky behaviors, earlier sexual activity, teenage pregnancy, joining gangs, running away from home, and sexually transmitted diseases. You are more likely to have social problems, difficulty forming healthy relationships, unstable work history, which means putting yourself and your family back into financial struggles and poverty, continuing that cycle. It may negatively impact your ability to finish high school or get an education or go to college or your job opportunities or your future earning potential. We have an increased risk of suicide for adults and self-mutilation for adults. We have an increased risk of partner violence, that you will either be abusive or choose someone who is abusive. We have an increased risk of elder abuse. So we see older adults who have gone through ACEs are more susceptible to being re-abused. And you have a likely chance of passing this on to the next generation. These negative effects get passed on to children and it becomes a family cycle. So how are we going to heal from ACEs? Resilience and recovery. So resilience is how hardy you are, how much grit you have, that you can get through a tough time, you can get through trauma and not let it ruin your life, that you can get yourself to therapy. And children can develop resilience even if they've been exposed to all of the ACEs, all of these adverse experiences. How do we do this? Finding a counselor or a therapist, the earlier the better. Create a safe and stable environment. So children and adults who have been through these experiences, they want calm, they want predictable days, and they want situations that provide affection, consistency, attachment. Build relationships. Again, encourage children and adults to have close relationships, safe relationships with caring adults in the community. Could be a coach, could be someone at church, may not be the family. You can learn positive parenting skills. There are parenting classes and parenting videos and parenting books, so you can learn how to do better and be better than how you were raised. You can create a supportive community. You can get health support and all kinds of community support. Learn how to manage stress better. Anger management, stress management can really help. And things like EEG and neurofeedback can really help to heal childhood trauma. We'll learn about a whole bunch of strategies in the therapy section. And now you're ready for the next section.